Open our Bibles this morning to 2 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2. Second Timothy chapter 2, begin reading with verse 1. Thou therefore, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. And the things that thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men. Underline that word faithful. It won't be our point today, but you need to understand that we're to commit these to faithful men who shall be able to teach others also. Thou therefore endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. No man that warreth entangleth himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who hath chosen him to be a soldier. If a man also strive for mastery, yet is he not crowned, except he strive lawfully. And we're going to stop there for now. Tomorrow, I think most of us know, tomorrow is commonly called Memorial Day because it is a day that has been set aside to remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice to obtain and maintain the freedoms that we enjoy today. You know, I see bumper stickers and slogans. Freedom isn't free. The fact that we are free to assemble is the result of people before us fighting, gaining this freedom, keeping this freedom, just so that we could have the freedom to assemble. Originally, instead of Memorial Day, it was called Decoration Day, when the people would decorate the graves of the people that fought and died in the Civil War. I know that's going back just prior to my memory, but it was a day to decorate those who died in the Civil War. Later, it was changed to include everyone who had died from the Revolutionary War right down through the war in Iraq, Iran, and even the wars that are going on today. Tomorrow, many people will be placing flowers or flags on many of the veterans of our current day. My daughter and son-in-law my son-in-law began before he was married. Every year at Memorial Day, he starts now he starts a week early, but he started years ago. He individually, personally, would buy the flags and put them on one or two cemeteries there where they live. Then it began to grow and grow and grow. Now they have some 30 or 40 volunteers, and in the last week, they have put somewhere around 300 to 400 flags in multiple cemeteries throughout their county in honor of the men and women who fought and died. I firmly believe that these men and women deserve our thanks and our gratitude, because it was their sacrifice that allows us to be free even today. Now, some of you know I grew up near an Army base. My dad worked at the Army base for 32 years, so I grew up around military. And I grew up in a town where thousands, the 101st Airborne Screaming Eagles, I always have to throw that in. They were the 101st Airborne Screaming Eagles. We lived right there adjacent to the post. And I can tell you firsthand, not all soldiers were Christians. First of the month when they got paid, the bars were full. The other ill-gotten places were full. Not all of them were Christian, but all of them were soldiers. And though we totally disagreed with their lifestyle, they still deserve our appreciation for their service to our country. Working with the police department for 25 years, not all policemen are honest, faithful Christian men, but we honor them because they wear the blue or brown in the county. So too with soldiers. We may not like some of the things they do in their own time. We may not agree with some of their immoralities, but if they fought for our country, they deserve our thanks and our appreciation. Now, I'll throw this in as a side note. It really, really, really bothers me today to see men and women who have been trained to fight being forced, instead of training, instead of preparing for war, they're being forced to learn the proper pronouns. They're being forced into this woke mentality instead of fighting. And my prediction is if that doesn't stop soon, we will no longer be the land of the free. My sermon is very easy. I have 2 points. Doesn't mean you get out in half the time, but I have 2 points. First of all, the American patriot or soldier, and then secondly, the Christian soldier. A lot of similarities, some differences, but I want to look at both of them. And then, as Paul said, we are to endure hardness as a soldier of Jesus Christ. So we look at soldiers for America, and then look at Christian soldiers, and I hope you see a lot of similarities. In American history, and you know I'm not a great historian, but in American history, there have been several days set aside to honor our soldiers. There is Memorial Day, which is tomorrow. There is the 4th of July to celebrate the men who fought and freed America from England. There's D-Day, when our soldiers died by the thousands to conquer a beach that would eventually lead to our victory. There's the bombing of Pearl Harbor. All of these are days set aside to honor the men who fought and died. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, men began to volunteer by the thousands. Volunteer to go fight, to conquer the enemy that was determined to destroy us. History from the Revolutionary War down to the present day, there have been men who volunteered and some were drafted, but they fought so that we could remain free. I think of our present day. Thankfully, there are men and women today who are still willing to, now it's an all-volunteer army, so they volunteer, they go through, it used to be 6 weeks of intense, strong training and training and training. Then they go into more training, and the ones that go into specialties, and we hear a lot about the Navy SEALs. I grew up Army. It wasn't the Navy SEALs, it was the Green Beret. And I can still sing, the Green Beret song, because those were men that went above and beyond. They did the basic training, they did the advanced training, and then, and like I say, we hear a lot about the Navy SEALs, but they would go through intense. Out of 100 men that applied for Green Beret school, only 3 out of 100 would be accepted. And they were worked and drilled and trained to be able to do anything. And I'm thankful for those men. I'm thankful that they were willing to take the extra time, the extra work, the extra challenges to train themselves to be the very best that they could be. There are a few of us old enough to remember what freedom really meant. And some of us are old enough to understand what happens when a country loses their freedom. But for many, patriotism is still something to be respected. Nowadays, our soldiers are more trained to make sure, are you she, he, or he, she, or what is your gender? What do you think your gender is? And if they get it wrong, they can be, tried, they can be punished, and all kinds of things. That's not how it started out, and that's not how it ought to be. President Reagan once said, whether you loved him or hated him, President Reagan once said that freedom is never more than one generation from extinction. Now, let's look at the Christian soldier. And by the way, I concur. What President Reagan said about our country is being said and seen in our churches today. I don't know. I have watched, I've observed, I've been preaching for over 50 years, and during that time I have seen, I have heard from preachers' kids to deacons' kids, to church members' kids. Their parents served God. Their parents stood for the truth. Their parents fought for the truth. And yet somehow today, we've got a generation that were raised in sound Baptist churches like our doctrinal statement. They were raised in Christian homes who today are selling the truth in favor of entertainment. I could name you names that I'm not sure I could get them all on a sheet of paper. People that I knew, people that I grew up with, people that my wife grew up with who were taught the truth, but somewhere along the line, they chose entertainment over truth. Just as our nation is only one generation where freedom goes into extinction, our churches are only one generation from losing everything that our forefathers stood for. Now, as I said, we, in our text, we are called soldiers. We are to be a good soldier. We don't need deadbeat soldiers. We don't need part-time soldiers. We don't need occasional soldiers. My dad was in the Army during World War II. My brother was in the Army during the Vietnam War. And I can only imagine, my dad went to his, they do roll call one morning, and where's Carl Ellis Jr.? Oh, he decided to sleep in this morning. I can just imagine my brother, Sergeant Ellis. Where's Sergeant Ellis? Oh, he went home to visit his family. How long do you think they would be in good standing in the Army? I know what would happen. We had a couple of drill sergeants in our church. We had a couple of Green Berets in our church. I know what they would do if they just said, I got these new boots and they're a little harsh on my feet. I'm not going to run today. I'm not going to march today. You see the folly of that in the real armies. And yet I never cease to be amazed at the excuses people use to not serve God. I'm going to read you a couple of verses here. In Hebrews chapter 11, I'm going to start reading with verse 36. Others had trial of cruel mockings. How many of you have ever been just laughed at and scoffed at because of your stand for Christ? He had trial of cruel mocking and scourgings, beatings. Has anybody here ever been beaten with the whip because of their stand for Christ? These were soldiers. They were in bonds and imprisonment. I've been in a lot of jails over the years, but I was there to preach in many cases. And I knew that I could get out when I got through preaching, or when we took somebody that we arrested. I knew that I could always get out. They were thrown in prison. They were thrown in jail. Some of them were chained to the floor, chained to the wall. They were imprisoned because of their stand. They were stoned. Not drunk stoned, but stoned with rocks. They were sawn asunder. They would be strapped down, tied down, and then a saw slowly would go back and forth until it began to rip the skin. And then it would keep on and keep sawing deeper and deeper until they finally died. Has any of us ever been sawn in half because of what we believe? Not only that, They were tempted. They were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins, goatskins, being destitute. They lost their house. They lost their furniture. They lost their bank accounts. They lost their money. They lost everything, so that they had to literally kill a lamb and make clothes out of it. They were destitute. They were afflicted, and they were tormented. Some of them were forced to live in the desert. Some of them were forced to move way up into the mountains. Some of them were forced to live in dens and caves. I used to, back when I was in high school, college, we used to go to Mammoth Cave a lot. And you know, we would take different caves, and it was nice to go through there, but I would not want to live down there. I remember one time we were in one of Mammoth's caves, and I just, out of curiosity, someone asked, just curious, how deep below the surface are we? And the guide said, we're between 4 and 5 miles below surface. How would you like to live down there? Well, we go on in chapter 12. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. Everyone in chapter 11 is a witness that we have, that we can study, and that we are to imitate. We are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which doth so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Paul said back in our text that a person runs and that a soldier fights to please the one who called him, who literally drafted him, to whom he works for. We are to look unto Jesus. Until we have accomplished and reached perfection, as you mentioned, until we have reached perfection, until we have reached holiness, until we have died, we remain soldiers of Jesus Christ. I was listening to Dr. David Jeremiah Friday, and I don't listen to him all the time, but I listen to him sometime, and he was talking about when he was younger, didn't say how young, but younger, how that he contacted something and almost died as a result of it. But God spared his life. And he said, personally, I'm glad he did. But you know what? He said, God spared my life. That means I'm to keep preaching, keep doing, keep going. When does a Christian retire? I'm not going to ask you that, but when does a Christian retire from the army? When they lower us in the grave and put the dirt over top of us. Until then, as long as we're alive, as long as we have breath, as long as we can do anything, we are still in the army of God. I was talking to a man a couple days ago, and he said something, and I said, oh, you were in the military. He said, yes, I was in the army. And I said, how long were you there? He said, I put in my 20 years, and I retired. police department, good friend of mine, put in 28 years with the police department and retired. There is no retirement in the army of Christ. If you're alive and you're breathing and you can still halfway think and you can halfway act, you are a soldier of Jesus Christ. Well, I can't go out on the battlefield like I once did. Well, this is a lot easier now than it was 50 years ago. But you know what? Maybe you are handicapped. Your arm is not functioning properly. Maybe you've been laid up. You got COVID and it left you in a terrible state, or some other calamity. Well, I guess I'll retire. You can retire from work, but you can't retire from the Lord's army. Well, what can I do? I can't go visiting. I can't do stairs anymore. Not hardly anyway. I can't do steps. I can't walk for miles like I used to. But you know what? Every one of you that are saved in the army of Christ, every one of you can do something. Maybe you can't go out door to door. Maybe you can't, volunteer and lift paper and run the machinery back in the shop. How many of you have a telephone? You don't have a phone? Then how will I call you all the time? I think every one of us have a phone. There are people that are lonely. There are people that are literally confined to home because of health. And they're lonely. You can call them up and brighten their day. In fact, if you want to, I'll give my brother your phone number, and he'll call you 5, 10, 15 times a day. And he tells me real frequently, especially when he's called 5, 10 times already, he'll call me up and say, I'm just lonely. I just want somebody to talk to. There are people that don't have his problem, that are confined to home, that could just use a phone call. Now, you can do that, can't you? I know every one of you can talk. Just call them up and say, hey, I know it gets lonely sitting at home. You're still a soldier. And though you may not fight, you may not be out on the forefront, you're still a soldier of Jesus Christ, and you can still serve in some capacity. I think of the great Christians of yesteryear. And Brother Jerry and I used to talk, every week, sometimes more than once. But he loved history, and he loved talking about some of the great saints of yesteryear. And I saw a documentary one time on TV, and I thought it was fiction. I was watching this documentary thinking, oh, wow, this is a good movie. So I called him up and I said, hey, Brother Jerry, you're not, and he said, that was not fiction. That was true. What you saw was true. And it's like, Wow. And I won't give you the whole 2-hour movie, but it was about people that were willing to stand up and fight, literally fight and die on American soil because there was a group that was trying to take away our freedom. And this group gathered together, stood together with the other men armed and shooting. They stood up, they stood together and fought so that we could have. He said, brother, that wasn't fiction. And I wondered when I was preparing the message, how many of us would stand like they did? With guns drawn, bullets going back and forth. How many of us would stand up for the truth? Some would not even stand up if it meant being laughed at. Why, if I stand, they will laugh at me. That's better than shooting you. I don't know. At least I'd be in heaven. You never stop being a soldier. I thought of the Apostle Paul. Man, you read there in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, some of the things that the Apostle Paul endured. He's got peril after peril after peril after peril. You read in Philippians chapter 3 what Paul had to give up. Gave up his family, gave up his position, gave up everything. And you know what? He counted those things but dung. That's how little the things of the world counted. Paul could say with all seriousness, I could wish myself accursed if it would mean the salvation of my brethren. I thought of other great warriors. Fox's Book of Martyrs. And it's hard reading. You know, I've spent years trying to finish it. It's hard reading because it describes in detail how many Christians were killed. Women were tortured. Women were raped. Women were abused. All of them were killed in some form or other. Some were burned at the stake. They would tie them, put branches all around them, light a fire, and as the fire moved in, they would get hotter and hotter until it finally burned them to death. How many of us would stand? And yet our forefathers did. You know, I confess, I get annoyed with myself. I know y'all do too, but it's a different reason. I read some of these great men, and I think, stop whining and complaining. You haven't done anything like they have done. I've never had anyone bust my house door down and come in with guns and shoot my kids and shoot my wife and then shoot me. I've never been tied at a stake and burned to death slowly. It wasn't like dousing somebody with gas and lighting a match. This was done deliberately to make it as slow and as painful as possible. I've never had that done, and yet sometimes I get, oh man, I have done so much. We have not yet begun to fight. We are free to assemble. and yet many people don't. Now, I don't know. I would have to go back and check with our clerk and see exactly how many members we've got right now. But I have a fairly good ballpark. And yet, where are most of our members today? I see the ones that are here, and I really appreciate those of us who come Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. We're here every time. Revival, we're here every night. We're here every service. But what about those soldiers that just don't come? Don't bother to show up. And if they do, they don't want to fight. They don't want to stand. I remember my brother more so than my dad. When my dad was in the Army, I don't remember any of that because I wasn't born for 5 years later. But I remember my brother, and like I say, living right at the base. My dad working at the base. There were times that they got latrine duty. How many of you know what latrine duty is? Most of you. That's where you get to go in and clean out the toilets. In Vietnam, they didn't have flush toilets. They had outdoor toilets like I grew up with. And if you were not behaving, they would give you the job of cleaning out under those outside toilets. Oh, I don't want to do that. That's dirty. That stinks. You know, we often think that coming to church, we come in, the building's nice and clean, the pews are clean, the toilets are clean, you know, the door handles are wiped off with alcohol to make sure they're clean. You know, there's a lot of work that goes into just maintaining the trustees, which we do need to have a meeting. The trustees, there are things that break down, that need repair, things that happen. And yet people walk in and think nothing about, wonder who cleans this. They don't even think about it being clean. We have food, they eat, they leave. You know, there's a lot of work. When we had the police officer appreciation, those that came and volunteered, they put in somewhere around 12 to 13 hours. When all the police officers left, there was still another 30 minutes to an hour cleaning up, cleaning the dishes, cleaning the tables, cleaning this, fixing up that. I learned that as a soldier, you don't get to pick what you want to do. The sergeant comes in. Sergeant Ellis, yes, sir. You're assigned to whatever. Well, I don't like that job. Can you get somebody else to do that job? As a soldier, you know, now, I was kidding my brother, just for those of you that are familiar with military. He volunteered to go to Vietnam. But the day the orders came down, the day before they were supposed to leave, going to Vietnam, somehow his orders didn't come through. So everybody in his battalion loaded the plane except him and one other man whose orders didn't come through. Instead, he got sent to South Korea, and I don't know how he did it, but he became the supply sergeant for the base. If you know anything about supply sergeants, they do almost nothing. But he was still in the army. He still had to serve. He still had to be at his post. When he was on guard duty in the States, he couldn't say, I'm on guard duty. My favorite show's on TV. They won't miss me for an hour. They would have court-martialed him. You know, when the army gathers together, every soldier must be in their place. I don't like the job I've got. I think the sergeant made a mistake. I think the lieutenant, misunderstood, or I just don't agree. And I remember my brother telling me this. If they did something wrong, Sergeant Ellis, yes, sir, here's a toothbrush. You know where I'm going? Did you ever have to do that? Here's a toothbrush. I want you to get down on the floor, and I want you to clean the entire bathroom with the toothbrush. Every square inch. Well, I don't think it's necessary. I didn't ask you what you thought. I'm the sergeant. Here's the toothbrush. You go in the room, and you don't come out till you have scrubbed every square inch of that bathroom with a toothbrush, and I will inspect. Well, I disagree. You're in the army. Listen, we're in the Lord's army. And sometimes we don't always, in the flesh, like everything that we're asked to do. And I'm almost done. Ronald Reagan also made the statement, bravery is not, let me find it. Bravery is not the absence of fear. Bravery is fear under control. Sure, we get scared, but through the grace of God, He gives us the ability, and we're able to do everything He asked of us. I close, and I'm not going to sing, but I'm going to close with a song. Some of you may recognize it, but I want you to listen to the words. Surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us run the race, not only for the prize, but as those who've gone before us, let us leave to those behind us the heritage of faithfulness passed on through godly lives. After all our hopes and dreams have come and gone, and our children sift through all we've left behind, may the clues that they discover and the memories they uncover become the light that leads them to the road we each must find. And then the chorus goes like this. Oh, may all who come behind us find us faithful. May the fire of our devotion light their way. May the footprints that we leave lead them to believe. And the lives we live inspire them to obey. Oh, may all who come behind us find us faithful.